Look at the fur for a second. Not the animal, just the fur. Up to 1,000,000 hairs packed into a single square inch of skin, the densest coat of any creature that has ever lived. A sea otter has no blubber, none of the thick fat that keeps a seal or a whale warm. It survives the cold Pacific on this alone. A coat so fine it traps a layer of air against the skin like a wetsuit woven from 1,000,000 threads. It is one of the most beautiful things evolution ever built. And it is the exact reason men sailed across an ocean to kill every last one of them. Because a coat like that is worth a fortune. When Russian explorers reached Alaska in the year 1741, the fur traders followed fast, and they found a pelt softer and warmer than anything on the market. So they hunted across the entire North Pacific, from Alaska down to Mexico. For more than a century and a half, they took every otter they could find. The thing that made this animal a marvel was the thing that signed its death warrant. Remember that, because the fur is going to matter again later, in a way nobody saw coming. Before the hunting started, somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 sea otters lived along the North Pacific coast. By the early 1900s, the entire species on Earth had been reduced to perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 animals, scattered in a handful of tiny remnant colonies, each one barely hanging on. In California, people stopped looking. The southern sea otter was simply gone, declared extinct, a memory, except it wasn't. Hidden along the cliffs of Big Sur, on one of the most remote and hardest to reach stretches of the entire California coast, a single small group had survived, about 50 animals. They had hidden in the one place the hunters found too difficult to reach. For decades, almost no one knew they were there. Then, in 1938, Life magazine published a photograph of a raft of otters floating in the Kelp near Bixby Bridge, south of Monterey, and called it one of the rarest sights on Earth. Every southern sea otter alive in California today descends from that one tiny colony. 50 animals against an entire ocean of absence. And here is where the story turns, because people finally decided to protect them. In 1911, the United States, Britain, Japan, and Russia signed a treaty banning the open water hunting of seals and sea otters. It was the first international agreement ever written to save a wild animal from disappearing. Later came the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, which still list the southern sea otter as threatened today. Slowly, painfully slowly, the otters came back, from 50 to a few hundred, and eventually to around 3,000, spread along the central California coast, roughly from Monterey Bay down to Point Conception. But nobody yet understood what they were really getting back. They thought they were saving a cute animal. They had no idea they were saving the keystone that holds up an entire underwater world. That discovery happened far to the north, in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, where a young scientist named Jim Estes spent decades diving the same cold water again and again. He noticed something strange. Some islands had otters, and around those islands the seafloor was a forest, towering kelp swaying in green-gold light, thick with fish and life. Other islands had no otters, and around those, the seafloor was a desert, bare rock, carpeted in spiny purple sea urchins and almost nothing else. The difference was not the water or the weather. It was the otter. The mechanism is brutally simple, and it traces straight back to that fur. An otter with no blubber burns calories at a furious rate, 2 to 3 times faster than a land animal its size. To stay alive, it has to eat a quarter of its own body weight every single day. A single otter can crack open and devour as many as 50 sea urchins in one day. And sea urchins, left unchecked, are a plague. They graze kelp down to nothing, shredding the holdfasts until a living forest becomes a lifeless barren. So where the otters feed, the urchins stay in check, and the kelp explodes upward into a forest. Where the otters are gone, the urchins win, and the forest dies. In 1974, Estes put that idea on paper, and it became the textbook example of a keystone species. Pull the otter out, and the whole structure collapses. So think about what that actually means. The animal humans nearly erased for its fur turned out to be the free, living machine that builds and protects one of the richest ecosystems on the planet. And the proof kept stacking up closer to home. In a quiet, polluted estuary near Monterey, called Elkhorn Slough, the eelgrass beds had been dying for years, choked by algae fed on farm runoff. Then, starting in 1984, the otters moved back in. And the eelgrass came roaring back, growing roughly 6 times thicker over 3 decades. The otters never touched the eelgrass. What they did was eat the crabs. Fewer crabs meant an explosion of tiny sea slugs that graze algae, and those slugs scrubbed the eelgrass clean enough to grow again. A scientist named Brent Hughes traced that whole chain reaction and published it in 2013. One animal, 2 different ecosystems, both rebuilt from the bottom up for nothing. Now hold that next to what humans do to get the same result. California has poured real money and enormous effort into saving its kelp. Restoration crews dive down by the thousands of hours to smash and vacuum up purple urchins by hand. Groups like Reef Check got around $500,000 just to cull urchins on the North Coast. The Greater Farallones Association pulled in nearly $5 million more. California ocean agencies have spent tens of millions on kelp recovery, and federal lawmakers pushed for $50 million a year to fund it. Year after year, program after program, the bill for trying to grow back an underwater forest climbs into the kind of money that makes you stop and ask a simple question. Why are we paying all of this, when one animal does the same job and asks for nothing but a place to float? The otters were saved. The kelp came back. At least, that is what everyone thought. Because there is one stretch of coast where the story falls apart completely. Northern California, the Sonoma and Mendocino coast, where the otters never returned. They have not been seen up there since the 1800s. And in 2013, a disease called sea star wasting began melting the sea stars off the entire west coast, including the sunflower sea star, the one other big predator that kept urchins down. Then, in late 2014, a vast blob of abnormally warm water settled over the coast. The purple urchins exploded into the millions. With no otters and no sea stars left to eat them, nothing stood in their way. And the bull kelp forests of Northern California collapsed by more than 95% along a 350-mile stretch in just a few years. A forest the size of a coastline, gone, replaced by a purple desert. A study led by the Monterey Bay Aquarium looked at a full century of California kelp from 1910 to 2016, and the result was almost unbelievable. The single strongest predictor of whether kelp lived or died was the density of sea otters. On the Central Coast, the one place the otters survived, kelp canopy actually grew by more than half. In the north, where the otters were absent, it fell by 63%. The otter recovery on that one middle stretch of coast nearly canceled out the catastrophic losses everywhere else. The animal was doing the work. It just could not be everywhere it was needed. And that is where this stops being a clean, feel-good story. Because the otter is not a saint. To rebuild the kelp, it eats. Relentlessly. It eats abalone, it eats crab, it eats the very urchins that some fishermen sell. And so the people who want to bring otters back to Northern California and Oregon are fighting the people who fish those waters. The chairman of the California Sea Urchin Commission warned that reintroduced otters would devastate the fisheries, pointing to the pismo clams and the abalone grounds that vanished once otters spread decades ago. Abalone divers ask whether the otters will simply strip mine the ocean. On the other side, the Kashiapomo people and tribes up in Oregon want the otter back and see its return as healing a coast that has been broken for 200 years. So here is the real question, and I genuinely want your answer. If you ran this coast, would you bring the otters back to heal the kelp forest, even if it meant gutting the abalone, the crab, and the urchin that families and tribes make their living on? Or do the fishermen have the stronger case? There is no easy answer, and maybe that is the point. We hunted this animal down to 50 survivors for a coat we wanted. Then we spent a century and a fortune learning that the same coat, the same impossible hunger, was the cheapest and most powerful tool we ever had for healing the sea. The otter forgave us by simply going back to work. So the question that keeps turning over in my mind is this one. If a single animal can rebuild a forest for free, and we already know exactly where it is missing, what does it say about us that the forest is still dying there? Tell me what you think down in the comments.